Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Power Wash Simulator and Scrapperlock Rants. And we are going to do this bonus job. I've done it before a couple times. I like doing it. There's a lot of stuff on the ground that I can do, and you guys know how I like that. And I also like doing this top part here. Don't think I have any good power washers. No, you just have this one. All right, so as we go, what I want to do, and I'm probably going to be pausing out of this a lot to check my notes, is I want to have a conversation about a video that Alex Macris made. And I find myself in the unusual position of not entirely agreeing with him. I think he laid out some of the problem, but I think he's missed a whole lot. And I want to kind of talk about it. He and I have had a little bit of a debate in the comments, and you can read that if you want. So his video is called Player Skill versus Character Skill. And what he's asking is what happens when there's a mismatch, as he calls it, between player skill and character skill. So let's talk about what he means, and we'll talk about the ways that he described that you can kind of deal with it. And then I'm going to talk about why I think some of this is really not a problem or shouldn't be a problem. I know it is, but I think there's a way to think about it that can help you avoid the problem. And so we'll talk about that as well. So first, let's talk about his examples of player skill versus character skill. I'm not going to give them all, but he talks about situations in which the player has what he talks about are knowledge and skill, kind of as if they're the same thing. And so I think one of the things that we have a problem with here is that knowledge and skill are not the same thing, right? There's, for example, when my party walked into the temple in their fourth adventure, and I've told that story, where they could see kind of a map of on the floor as a mosaic. They could see a map of the cosmos, a map of the planes, right? And it was my own map. It was unique, but it was derived from the Great Wheel map of the planes in the D&D books. And you can look that up if you want to see what that looks like. And so mine was not identical, but it was similar. And it was done with circles, as the planes are often depicted as circles, right, in the Great Wheel cosmology. And the circles were inside each other and next to each other and had lines connecting them in such a way that it was pretty obvious to my best friend, who is a veteran of Dungeons and Dragons and knows all about the planes and has played Planescape and stuff before. It was pretty obvious to him what this was. Now that's knowledge. It's not skill, right? He has a knowledge of the cosmology. And so my friend knew that this was a sort of a, what do you want to call it, a stylized depiction of the planes of existence, right? The chaos plane, the order plane, whatever. Now, he didn't know what planes I was using in my game, but he could tell what this was supposed to stand for. And as they were looking at this thing and talking about it, and the other characters didn't, know what it was, right? My best friend said, well, I know what I think I know what this is, but my character wouldn't. So I'm not going to say anything, right? So this is, and I've used this as an example before, entirely what you're supposed to do, right? Your character doesn't know this, so he wouldn't be able to tell the other players what it is, the other characters what it is. Now, he could have said as a player, I can tell you guys as players what this is. But he didn't do that either, because we had a new player among us, and I guess he realized that she would probably want to, figure it out herself. And so he didn't say anything, right? That's knowledge. Then there's having skill that you have that the character wouldn't have. For example, and this is the example that Macros uses, you're playing what he calls a 3 charisma bard. Or in Savage Worlds, it would be a D4 spirit character with unskilled D4 minus 2 in persuasion. And yet the player is a very, very eloquent, he's maybe he's actually professionally does negotiations for his company. He's very good at making negotiations. And so he's able to come up with this really eloquent speech that he says his character would say, right? So the persuasion act is not knowledge, it's skill, right? It's an ability to do something, right? It's not something that it's not a bunch of facts that you have in your head, it's a skill, right? And so that's a separate thing. And I would argue that most of the time, although not always, because the player characters are doing stuff that's other than something like negotiation, everyday stuff, outside of the skill set of normal people, right? If you're playing Deadlands, right, and your character's a gunslinger and getting into a duel, I mean, even if you're somebody who knows how to use a gun, you probably don't know how to do a duel. Because people don't duel anymore, and it's not a skill that we have in society, right? Or if you're playing D&D and your character is casting a spell, you don't have spell casting ability in real life, right? Because you can't cast Fireball. So a lot of times where the struggle of how do I play this, right? That's really what's going on, right? The question is, how do I play this? I know something my character might not know, or I have a skill my character might not have. How do I play this, right? And of course, there's the reverse situation. I don't have knowledge that my character would have. And so how do I roleplay something I don't know anything about? Or, and again, this is more common, I don't have a skill that my character would have. And how do we roleplay that? So if you think about the reverse situation, the awkward, and this again, Macros gives this example, sort of the awkward shy player who's not very verbal and not very good at coming up with improvisational speeches, and yet the bard has, a D10 spirit, if we're going to use Savage Worlds, and a D10 persuasion. So how do you deal with that, right? And usually the way to deal with it is to just say, well, my bard would say something persuasive here, I don't know what it would be, right, as a player, but as a character, I think the bard would be able to come up with something persuasive here. And so what Macros then says is, how do you handle this situation? Does the GM say, well, if you can't come up with something clever to say, neither can your bard? Or does the GM say, okay, make a roll, and you ace the roll and you get like a 36, a success with 4 raises on the persuasion, and he says, okay, you persuade the king to give you his kingdom, or whatever it is, right? So is it okay to do that? Well, I would say yes. So those are the 2 things that Macros talks about, which is the knowledge, like how do you deal with player and character knowledge being different, and how do you deal with player and character skill being different. But as I said in my post, and I'm not sure if he really grokked it, one of the things he doesn't talk about, but is, I think, more important than the other 2, and is kind of the linchpin of how you actually play this, is behavior, right? What happens when the character's behavior is different from yours? I am not a brave warrior, but I might play one in a role-playing game, and that character is going to behave in a way that I would not personally behave. Okay? And so how do you handle that? Well, you're supposed to be role-playing, right? You're supposed to be playing the role of the character. That's what the challenge of the game is. So Macris talks about 4 approaches, and I think he misses the 5th and the most important one. He kind of, his 4th is similar to it, but I think, again, I think he's missing an important element to this, which is the behavior element. So his first approach is the strict skill-based approach, right? If your character has the skill, you can do it, and if your character doesn't have the skill, you can't. And, well, that's kind of the way the mechanics of most games are written, right? He says that this is true in crunchy games, but lots of games are like this, where if you don't have, if you don't have the occult skill in Savage Worlds, you're rolling D4 minus 2, and you're probably not going to succeed at an occult roll. Now you might ace a couple of times and get a success with a raised, but the odds are against it, and you're probably not going to succeed at the occult roll. And then your character won't be able to do whatever it is your character was trying to do with that roll. So that's one way. The other way is to rely primarily on player ability. And he says, for example, in like LARPs and stuff, where if you're having a sword fight, it's actually, you guys are batting at each other with foam swords, hopefully not real ones. And if you hit when you hit, right? And other than in a LARP, it's unlikely that you're going to use like player ability to do things like pick an actual lock or hit a goblin or a supervillain with a blast or anything like that, because you know that kind of thing doesn't exist in real life for us to even try to do it for real. So that's the second way. So one way is to be entirely skill-based. If your character has the skill or the knowledge, you can do it. If they don't, you can't. The other way is, if you as a player have the skill or knowledge, you can do it. If you don't, you can't. A third way he talks about is non-overlapping magisteria. And that is what he calls sort of the old D&D method, which is if there's a way to roll it, you do, and if not, you just use player skill. So old school D&D was kind of like this, say with traps. They didn't really have a detect trap skill, so in order to detect a trap, you had to tell the GM where you were looking, and if you looked inside the keyhole and there was a poison needle inside the keyhole, the GM would say, yeah, you see a poison needle in there. But if you said, I'm looking on the outside of the, if you said I'm checking the lock, he'd say, where are you looking? Right? And then you'd have to tell him where, and if you didn't tell him the right spot, then you didn't see the trap, right? And Macris calls this an unstable equilibrium. He argues that most modern game design is trending away from this, and therefore he doesn't think it's the sort of thing that can be done long term. And then his way that he recommends is what he calls a synergistic approach. And he says this is an approach where both player and character skill matter. The player gives the instructions, but the character executes them. So here's the problem with that. He doesn't really differentiate between knowledge and skill. He talks about them both, but as if they're synonymous. And as I've mentioned, I don't think they are, right? Knowledge is knowing facts of things, and skill is knowing being able to do something, execute something, right? And so for example, knowing whether the yellow mold is that you see on the wall is the yellow mold that's like poisonous and dangerous and could kill your characters, or whether it's just some random mold, that's knowledge, right? It's not really a skill, it's knowing stuff, right? And so, I mean, you can make a roll, like a smarts roll in Savage Worlds, or an intelligence check in D&D, or an intelligence roll in Champions to make it skill-like. But it's still sort of knowledge, right? And so you have the problem that if if you're saying that the player is the instruction manual telling the character what to do, and then the character makes a roll to see if he can do it, you're still potentially, I would say, metagaming, right? Because there's nothing in that definition that prevents the player who knows stuff the character shouldn't know from giving the character instructions that the character wouldn't even know to try to carry out in character. Right? So giving your character the instruction to see if they recognize the yellow mold is based on the out-of-character knowledge you have from reading the monster manual that there's something called yellow mold that your character, who's never been on an adventure before and never been outside of his farm, wouldn't know. Right? And so I think, and then beyond that, so I think, so how am I going to say this? I think that it's not, I think it's not useful to do instructions versus skill, because the instructions, that doesn't prevent the instructions from being instructions your character wouldn't have. Right? Why would your character have this knowledge? How do you know it in order to make the skill check? Okay? But then there's also behavior, right? Is your character the sort of character who would stop and pause and look at the mold, or is it your character the sort of character who's just going to rush in and start attacking things? Because behavior is very important. This is a role-playing game. You're supposed to be playing out the behavior of your character. And so I think he's right that there needs to be a synergy, but I don't think the definition of how the synergy works is correct. The idea that the player, because what he's almost saying is the player has the knowledge and the character has the skill, but that isn't true. And it doesn't even dovetail with his examples, some of which have players having knowledge that the character wouldn't have. Okay? So I think it's a mistake to define the player as the instructions and the character as the execution. Because sometimes the character shouldn't even have these instructions. So, how do I think this should be handled? Well, I think there's an ideal, right? And, Macris sort of hinted in his comment that he agrees with the ideal, but thinks that most GMs don't ever see their players doing it, and I hope that's not true. Because if it's the ideal, you would hope that sometimes people are hitting it, and everybody fails at it sometimes because it is the ideal. But I think the ideal is to play your character, to have your character behave as the character would behave, and not as how you would behave. Right? So the ideal is to say, what would my character do in this situation? Does the character have any conceivable knowledge or reason to hesitate at the door of this room and be suspicious of the mold? As a player, I may know what this is, but the character might not, right? And so we go back to my example of my best friend. He didn't even say to me, although I would have been willing to give him an Arcana check to check it out, to see if he knew. He didn't even say to me, would my character know this? Because his character, although a sorcerer, is not a scholar, right? He's not a wizard. He's not a researchy type character, and in his background, he was basically almost like a bard in the taverns and stuff, and a bit of a thief with his girlfriend. And he doesn't have a lot of formal education or learning in magic, in like arcane stuff, right? So because he doesn't have that education, my best friend didn't even say, he didn't even ask, can I make a knowledge roll here to see if my character would know this? As a role player, he said, my character wouldn't know this, so I'm not even going to say anything. Okay? I know what this is, but my character wouldn't, so he's just going to be as baffled as everybody else. That's called role-playing, right? That's not him being the instruction manual and the character then rolling to see if he can do the instruction. It's just role playing, right? What would your character do in this situation? It might be based on skills or what you know. It might be based on your knowledge, but the behavior is what matters. As the name of the game suggests, these are role playing games, not skill check games, right? It's not a skill simulator, it's a role playing game. And the goal is to play the role of your character. So you shouldn't even be asking to make a check if you don't think the character would do that. Right? So go back to the example of the good negotiator in real life who's having his 3 charisma barbarian or his 4 spirit D4 minus 2 persuasion barbarian from Savage Worlds make this incredible, you know, oratorical speech worthy of like the greatest orators in Roman history. Like, why are you role playing that? You're playing a character with D4 spirit and D4 minus 2 persuasion. You shouldn't be trying to have the character act that way. It's metagaming. It's having your character act on knowledge the character wouldn't have or with an ability the character doesn't have and you know it. Okay? As a game master, I would say, if you want to play a character who's really good at persuasion, make up a character with a high persuasion. Don't make a D4 minus 2 persuasion character and then try to come up with a bunch of out-of-character roleplay that you think I'm going to give you credit for doing. You're not supposed to do that in a role-playing game, right? That's not. It's not even just metagaming, right? It's cheating. It's literal cheating to have your character act on knowledge it doesn't have and do things it shouldn't do. You designed this character. Don't make up an ignoramus and then have them act like a genius. That's just basic role-playing. Right? So, again, the yellow mold. I'd be willing to say to the person, okay, it's possible that you heard a rumor back on the farm. Maybe your father heard a rumor from a neighbor about yellow mold. So go ahead and make a smarts roll at -2, right? And then you get, you ace it, you get a success with a raise. And it's okay, you have heard legends about this. And now you can roleplay about it because you've made the skill check or the trait roll and the attribute roll, whatever. And the dice say that your character has heard about this before. All right. But you can't do it without the roll. Okay? Now, Macros argues again in the comments that this kind of people playing their character properly instead of optimally is rare in role-playing games. He seems to make the argument that, at least in his experience, most gamers, most role-playing game players, are trying to do the optimal thing, not the in-character thing. And so you have to kind of find a way to regulate this, right? That allow them to try the optimal thing, even if it's not in character to know to do it, but then use a skill check or whatever to see if they succeed at the optimal thing. His argument is that people metagame, and as a game designer, he tries to build a game that essentially won't break when people metagame rather than trying to write a game that assumes they won't. I feel like metagaming shouldn't come under the purview of the rules. It should come under the purview of the game master and the group and how much metagaming you want to do as a group. But I think Macros misses the point entirely here, and I'm looking at my notes again to just make sure I say it the right way. I think he misses the point because Colville, how do I say this? This whole argument about whether you should do what your character can do or whether you should do what you as a player want to do misses a point about what the challenges are about. And so I want to talk about the challenge in 2 different ways. The first is the challenge of succeeding at the task. And the other is going to be the challenge of playing the game, which is different. For succeeding at the task, I think Matt Colville explains this much better than Macros. He talks about how some challenges in a role-playing game are meant to be challenges to the characters. And those challenges are resolved with skill checks or the equivalent, right? But some challenges in a role-playing game are meant to challenge the players, right? And those challenges can and should be solved with player abilities. So the most obvious example of this is a puzzle or a riddle, right? When you do this, right, it's not really possible for the characters to solve the puzzle, except in the trivial case if the GM says, you see a puzzle here, make a die roll to see if you can solve it, which is super boring and there's no point to doing that. When you give the players a riddle, or a puzzle, like a lever puzzle in a dungeon where you have to, like, I don't know if you've ever seen these, but you pull and push on levers and they raise and lower doors, and there's a series of doors, maybe 3 or 4 in a row, and you pull one lever and 2 doors go up and 1 door goes down. You pull another lever and 1 door goes up and 2 doors go down. And what you have to figure out how to do as a player in that circumstance is you have to figure out the sequence of ups and downs to get the doors to open so that you can walk through to the next section of the dungeon, right? And although you could say to the GM, can I make a smarts roll, and if I succeed you can just tell us the sequence, most GMs wouldn't want to do that. Most players wouldn't do that. They recognize immediately this is a player challenge, and our job as players is to solve this by figuring out, as players, using our brains, our noggins, and figuring out the sequence of levers to pull and push so that we can open all the doors and get to the next part of the dungeon. Okay? That's a player challenge, and players are meant to use their noggin to succeed at those challenges. Then there are character challenges, and these are challenges that are entirely based on the character, right? So the players walk into a room, and the GM has in their notes, right, that if the players state that they're looking around the room, make a notice roll, and on a success they see this, and on a raise they see that, right? Using Savage Worlds as an example. That's a character challenge, right? Because the character, what happens depends on not the player figuring it out, but the character figuring it out. So if the challenge needs trait rolls or skill checks, it's a character challenge. And if the challenge is something that's supposed to be figured out by the players, it's a player challenge. And so Colville talks about this, I think, in his one about Let's Build an Adventure that he did live. It's like his 60th or something episode, I think, on his running the game videos. And so he talks about that some things are player challenges and some things are character challenges, right? And so if it's a player challenge, not only is it okay to use your player skill, you're supposed to. And that's a case where it's actually not correct to use character skill, right? You're not supposed to say, when you have a riddle, can I make a smarts roll to solve it so we don't have to solve this riddle? You're like, that would be considered almost, not cheating, but you're certainly trying to bypass the point of the challenge, right? Which is for you as a player to solve this riddle, right? Now, if you don't enjoy riddles, you could always tell the game master that, and then the game master won't have you doing that anymore, right? But there are lots of other kinds of challenges that are player challenges, right? And then there are challenges that are character challenges, right? And so Macris doesn't really talk about this at all, and but I think that it's really important. And then something Cole doesn't talk about, but I will, is because I think they're the bulk of role-playing games is what I would call hybrid challenges. And a hybrid challenge is a challenge that the players have to overcome partly with player skill and partly with character skill. And I would argue that combat is actually a hybrid challenge, because one element of combat is entirely character-based, right? Whether you hit a target depends on your shooting roll or your fighting roll or whatever, depending on the game, right? Or in Champions, your OCV versus their DCV and your 3d6 roll, right? So it depends on your to-hit roll. And your damage roll determines whether they take a wound or whether they're shaken or what have you, right? Whether they lose hit points, whether they're stunned in Champions or knocked unconscious. So, like, I mean, you can think about City of Heroes, right? That part of it is a character challenge. I target an enemy, right? I combat jump up to them, and I click crane kick. Now, whether I hit that guy or not is a character challenge, right? It's going to roll D100. I have a certain to hit. If I roll 95 or above, it's an auto hit. If I roll 5 and below, it's an auto miss. And in between, it compares my attack to their defense. And if you roll low enough, you hit. And if you roll too high, you miss. And that's entirely based on character skill. However, the tactical part of combat, where you're deciding who to attack, in what order, where you're deciding what attack to use on the enemies. You're going to cast a spell, or you're going to stab with a sword, or are you going to try to do a trip or a grapple? Are you going to attack the minion first, or the extras or the wild cards first? Are you going to attack the boss or the lieutenant or the elite boss first, right? Those kinds of tactics are entirely player-based, right? The player is using their knowledge of the game system to figure out the right way to attack. And the group might even have a group conversation. Who do you want to attack first? Etc. Right? And so, I mean, you can even think in City of Heroes where you're sitting there looking at a spawn, and you guys say, okay, like, let's do a pull, right? That's a player challenge. You're looking at the spawn, you're trying to figure out who to attack first. Okay, let's do a pull. But then when the character who's doing the pull fires and hits the target, whether they hit or not and how much damage they did is a character challenge, right? Dramatic tasks in Savage Worlds are part character challenge and part player challenge. And actually, Macris refers to this not for dramatic tasks because he doesn't seem to reference Savage Worlds. I don't know if he's ever seen it or played it. But he references skill challenges and says, this is like pure character skill. No, it's not. For both dramatic tasks and skill challenges, part of what you have to do when you're doing the challenge is figure out what skill you want to use and in what order. So for instance, in skill challenges in D&D, I don't think this is true in dramatic tasks, but in D&D, in 4th edition skill challenges, traditionally, each character can only use a skill once, right? Different characters can use the same skill, but you can only use a proficient skill, and you can only use it once, right? So if you use Arcana the first round, when the next round comes out, you're going to have to use a different skill, right? So there may be a strategy to which skill you try to use first and second. And that's going to be based on what you know about the game mechanics, on what you know about the mechanics of the skill challenge that your character wouldn't have. It's not metagaming. It's part of the game to do the challenge, right? Just like in combat, it's part of the game to know the range of your weapons and how many grid squares there are between you and the enemy and what it means when a character is under partial cover, right? Those things are player challenges, right? Yes, technically the character knows these things, but you don't make a skill check to see if your character can figure out how far it is to the enemy. You just count the grid squares. It's a player challenge, right? But then whether you can hit or not is a character challenge, right? And the same thing with a dramatic task. You decide, based on like what's happening in the scene, which skill you want to try to use in this dramatic task. And for example, if you watch the Wildcards ETU game, they do dramatic tasks a lot, and there are several times where one of them gets a club, right? And in Savage Worlds, in a dramatic task, a club is a complication. You have -2 to whatever you try to do in your round, and if you fail your roll, the entire challenge, the entire dramatic task is failed, no matter what else has happened. And so if you watch, right, there was at least one time when Megan Caves got a club in a very important dramatic task, and she said, "I'm not going to do anything because I don't want us to fail the challenge." Okay? But she said, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm going not to act." That is a player challenge, right? That is a player decision saying, based on the mechanics of the game, if Adelaide acts here and she fails this roll, which is a character skill, right, the whole group fails the task. And I don't want us to fail the task as a player. And also my character doesn't want us to fail the task. So I'm going to find an in-character excuse why Adelaide wouldn't do anything here. Because as a player, I don't want us to fail the task. Right? And so that's a hybrid challenge, right? Because part of it is understanding the rules of a skill challenge and figuring out how to use your character's abilities to best succeed at those rules. And the other bit is the character's abilities itself. Okay? So you're kind of doing both, and that's why I call it a hybrid challenge. Let's see, what do I want to do here? I think I want to hit this. So let's do this layer. No, I think we want to do down. All right. So I think this is actually the key. That most challenges in role-playing games are actually hybrid challenges that partially challenge the player and partially challenge the character. And this is where the other type of challenge comes in, where we're not talking about the challenge of the task, but the challenge of the game you're playing, the challenge of playing Champions, the challenge of playing Dungeons and Dragons, of playing Savage Worlds, of playing Call of Cthulhu, is to play your character the way it would act. It's not how to overcome tasks in the game, but how to do so by playing your character well and having your character do what your character would normally do based on their personality, their skills, and their in-character knowledge. That is the challenge of the role-playing game, right? And what Macris is sort of saying is, how do you play a role-playing game if you're not really concerned with role-playing? That's what it seems to me, right? Because the guy playing the three charisma barbarian, who comes out with this wonderful dialogue to try and convince the king not to put him in prison, is failing a different challenge. Not the challenge of being imprisoned, but the challenge of the role-playing game. Because you're supposed to be playing your character. And if you were trying to play your character properly, you wouldn't be trying to make this, beautiful, eloquent speech worthy of the best speech writers in history, right? You'd be saying something very grunt-like, "Ugh, me angry at king. King not imprison me. King let me go, or me attack court and kill everyone." That's what a barbarian would probably say. Not, "Oh, your majesty, I am deeply sorry for what I have done, and I will, and then go on with this beautiful speech." No, a barbarian with a 3 charisma wouldn't say that. So why are you having your character say it? Right? And so I think this is the key. The real challenge of a role-playing game, of any role-playing game, is to play your character correctly, to play your character the way they would be played, to have your character act the way it would act. And if you do that, you won't be trying to use knowledge that your character doesn't have. You won't be trying to describe your character using skills that the character doesn't have. And you won't be behaving in ways that the character shouldn't behave. Just do what your character would do. And that actually solves all of it. Okay? And I think Macros is right in the sense that as a game designer, which he is, he cannot have his rules address this. It's something that happens between the GM and the players, but that's what you should be aiming for as a player, right? Is having your character do what it would do. Now, we have to be careful because it's what my character would do is often something the Wang Rod says in order to justify why the character is doing something that annoys the party. Right? So we do have to be a little careful. But as long as you are playing your character the way it's supposed, having your character do what your character would do and not annoying the other players doing it, you're good. And I went the wrong way here. So, we're going to wrap up here, but to conclude, the real challenge of the role-playing game is to overcome the tasks in the game by playing your character well and having the character do what it would do rather than what you would do. Right? I made up a character who was hesitant in the Critical Role game that we played as an interim game with one of the other players as a DM. And I said what I'm going to have this guy do sometimes, and I had only happened. We didn't do that much combat. It only happened a few times. But so what I'm going to have him do sometimes is he's hesitant. So what I'm going to have him do sometimes is, in combat, hold his action and say, well, when this other thing happens, then I will fire. Right? I did this a couple times where we were being attacked in the middle of an inn, and I said, I'm going to aim at the window because zombies were smashing through the window, and the next time I see something come through the window, I'm going to shoot at it. Right? There were other zombies in the room. I could have shot at them, but my character is hesitant. I did something that was suboptimal, something that I wouldn't normally do as a player. But because my character was hesitant, I had him do that. Or to use another example with the new girl in my group, she has a character who has fear of mice. It's a minor phobia. And they saw mice, and they were in this saloon, and they were in there looking for clues. They wanted to go in there. They thought there were some clues in there, right? And she saw a mouse, and she went out. She said, that's it, I'm out of there. Now, that wasn't the optimal thing to do. They were looking for clues, and her fleeing meant she couldn't help them look for clues, and she's one of their better noticers, right? She's got a good notice. And she's got a skill, an edge that gives her bonuses to notice rolls. So they want her in there. Optimally, she should be in there. But as a role player, she looked at her hindrances. She saw a mouse, and she said, nope, I'm out of here. Nope, nope, nope. And she just got up, and walked out. And when the other characters went out there to try and convince her to go back, she was like, nope, nope, nope. Not eating in there. I'm not going in there. It's dirty in there. Mice in there. I don't want any part of that. Nope, nope, nope. And she walked away. Okay? And they all ended up leaving for roleplay reasons, even though it probably would have been more optimal to stay and ask questions of the patrons and the workers in that establishment. Right? So, that's the ideal, is that you play your character to the best of your ability. And yes, you're certainly going to want to understand the rules of the game and play the game well, right? And if it's in character for you to do something optimal, go ahead and do it. But if it's not in character, then you bow to what the character would do. Again, as long as you're not being a wangrod and annoying anybody else, right? So what does it mean to be a wangrod? It means justifying annoying behavior by saying it's what my character would do. And again, there's a simple solution to this. Don't make up a character whose behavior, if you act it out, is going to annoy the other players. It's super simple to avoid being a wangrod and still have your character do what it would do. So, here's my takeaway. The real challenge of a role-playing game is not to overcome the tasks in the game, but to do so by playing your character well and by having it do what it would do instead of what you would do. And if you're actually trying to do that, there is no conflict between player skill and character skill. Because you wouldn't try to have your character who's never been off the farm try to ID yellow mold. Because you'd know the character wouldn't know it. So you wouldn't even try. You wouldn't try to eloquently woo the princess with your 3 charisma barbarian. You'd have him knock her unconscious, sling her over his shoulder, and carry her to his lair instead, because that's what that character would do. Okay? So there really isn't a conflict as long as you're playing your character. Role play your character, do what your character would do, and you won't try to make skill rolls the character wouldn't do or describe your character doing something it wouldn't be able to come up with doing. And so I think that's the key here. And and I, I understand that sometimes people struggle with this, but I don't think the solution to the struggle is to come up with some sort of a complicated scheme of when to, like, how the character is the executing the instructions of the player. That's not the point. The point should be the player shouldn't be giving the character instructions that the character wouldn't follow based on their behavior. I think we'll leave it there. Hopefully that was an informative video. I just wanted to kind of get that out. I don't like arguing with people on the internet, but I really think that it was hard for me to articulate this in the comment section because I didn't want to write a big long spammy comment. But I really think Macros's video kind of misses the point, which is that why are you having your characters trying to have your characters do things they wouldn't do, right? That, to me, that is a fundamental issue, and that needs to be solved first. If you solve that issue, then there's no problem. What do you guys think? Am I right about that? Am I just pie in the sky? Have I just been lucky all my life with playing role-playing games with players who at least understand the ideal that your character should only be doing what it would do? Not that we always achieve that ideal, and not that people didn't metagame, but we were always trying to achieve that ideal to some degree. Whether we succeeded or not, we were always attempting it, and we recognized it as the right way to, sort of the right way to do a role-playing game, in the sense of that's what a role-playing game is, right? I mean, if you want to play a different way, I guess, sure, go ahead, play it as a tactical simulation, but there are other games out there that I think do that better, and then you don't have to worry about playing a role. But if you're trying to play a role, you should be trying to play the character the way it would act. And then you wouldn't be using knowledge it doesn't have or trying to roll skills that it doesn't have. And then you don't have a problem. So, do you guys agree, disagree? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Power Wash Simulator. Let's rant with Scrapper.